Right, stand by, we've got to mute it. Okay, Andy, how do we mute? Okay. All right. Okay, is that the mute button? All right. All right, it's 6 p.m. Welcome to Northern Vibe. For new listeners, I'm very happy to report that each interview that we have has gained around 250 new viewers. This is Northern Vibe, a podcast produced in Cairns and hosted by me, Matt Maloney. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane, an organisation committed to forming a new state for North Queensland. For information as to what that means and entails, I encourage all listeners to log on to Boot Brisbane, our website there. It's full of information, full of a number of other interviews we've done as well. Please like and share this interview site and Northern Vibe. The reason that we've grown exponentially and so quickly is because of the support we're getting from people. So I really encourage you to keep listening. Make sure that you like and share. Today, I am lucky enough to have my friend, John Roskam. Now, John is a very interesting chap is somewhat of an understatement. Educated at Xavier College by the Jesuit Order, he went on to become the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre in Canberra. He's been a Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff to Federal and State Education Ministers, and was the Manager of Government and Corporate Affairs for a global mining company. His fortnightly column appears in the Australian Financial Review. He's a member of the editorial board for the Australian Journal of Public Administration and also Connor Court Publishing. He's on the advisory board for the Centre of Advanced Journalism at the University of Melbourne. He's a fellow of the Institute of Public Administration and is an honorary fellow of Campion College. It's a pretty long list and that's why I've had to read it, viewers. And of course, he is the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. Now, the Institute of Public Affairs is very active. I'm a very proud member. I suggest to all those interested in thought and public affairs, regardless of political affiliation, to log in and take advantage of all the information there. One thing you can say about the IPA, yes, it's conservative leaning, but if you like thought and you want to be engaged, it's the place for you. When John took over the think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, from that time, it's since gone from strength to strength. We met when he was on an IPA tour here in North Queensland. John, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Matt. How are you? From your face, it sounds like you could hear me yelling to the children to be quiet and reminding them that their dad had a very important Zoom talk at 6 o'clock. I hope I muted the microphone as I said, Dad on a Zoom.
That's okay, mate. I promise not to call the Victorian Department of Family Affairs down there, mate. Your secret's safe with me and, you know, our 1,000-odd viewers.
So, it's great to be with you.
Look, John, I'm genuinely thrilled that you joined me today to, you know, I'm going to have to embarrass you and, you know, do indicate that you're somewhat of a luminary. And of course, with the profile that you've got, it's going to bring considerable kudos and a little bit of gravitas to Northern Vibe, deservedly so, if I should say. Where
I think you bring plenty of gravitas yourself, Matt.
Yes. Well, there's been other adjectives.
You don't need a Melburnian to bring gravitas to Northern Vibe.
Oh, well, I don't know that, old boy. There's been several other adjectives used by by Il Presidente, Bill Bates, the president of my organisation, when describing what I'm doing here. But that's not really fit for family viewing, so I better not go into it. But let's roll right into it. Look, I know you are a Victorian, and it might seem a bit unusual for some of our viewers to go, well, Matt, why are you talking to this Victorian? But it's the perception of, you know, someone who's involved in a think tank, and of course someone and a national perception that I'm really keen on. And just to give you some degree of background, John, the reason Boot Brisbane was formed was because of the 2017 electoral redistribution. At that time, there was an extra 4 electorates created in the southeast corner. So that's around Brisbane. That resulted in 93 electorates in Queensland. Now, 73 electorates are with 73 of those electorates are within a 250-kilometre radius of the Brisbane Central Business District. Now, that only leaves 20 electorates for the rest of Queensland. Now, remembering that Queensland is about, I think it's about 1.85 million square kilometres, that 250-kilometre area in Brisbane has what I think we could accurately describe as a critical mass of electorates in the southeast corner, which is kind of distorting democracy. Look, I remember a conversation that you and I had over a couple of beers some years ago when you indicated you were very concerned about young people as a group becoming disenchanted with democracy. I'd like to start off with your comments on how much do you think dynamics like this distortion of democracy impact on something like that?
Well, thanks, Matt. And I think that's a really good explanation of what you're trying to do and why I'm so pleased to be supporting you and the program. As you said, I'm a Victorian, born and bred Melburnian, worked nearly all of my life in Melbourne, spent some time in Canberra, working for the Howard government, spent some time in London, working for Rio Tinto. And exactly as you said, many people would be interested in why is a Victorian interested in anything happening outside of Melbourne? And there's a couple of reasons. One is because I'm an Australian first and foremost. And I think what we're trying to balance is our commitment to each other as Australians and the common interests that we all have as Australians, with also the common interest of how do we best govern ourselves? How do we make our best decisions? How do we understand that Australia is a big and diverse country? And the point about a new state for Queensland or several new states, potentially perhaps, the point about the debate in relation to even succession in Western Australia in the 1920s and 30s, the question of the debate about local councils and their role and their future in the Federation, all goes to how do we govern ourselves? And one of the things that Australia has suffered from over recent years is what I call, and I live in it, the Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra bubble. I think we've seen the emergence of two Australias, Australians who are connected to the productive economy and those who are protected in some way. And this phenomenon applies, I think, to Queensland. From every experience I've had in Queensland, we have many members. The IPA now has close to 6,500 members. We have many members in Queensland. Charters Towers is, in fact, our centre of greatest demographic concentration, if you were to talk about IPA members in the country. And what we're seeing is exactly the same phenomenon as has happened to Australia, as is happening to Queensland. The interests of Brisbane are different from northern Queensland. The politics of Brisbane is different. That is reflected in energy policies. It's reflected in employment policies. It's reflected in policies related to agriculture and native vegetation, for example, policies on red tape, and anything that gets us having a conversation about how government can be brought closer to the people is very important. And I think that's exactly what you're doing, which is why you've got to be supported, and every best wishes to you on this regard, because it's really important, not just for Queensland, but for everyone in Australia.
Well, thanks very much for that, John. And in fact, you've reflected some of the comments that were made by Bernard Salt. He was good enough to give us an interview before I started Northern Vibe. He spoke to me as a member of Boot Brisbane when he was up here for an event. Bernard's an excellent guy. I was so impressed with him. He gave us 40 minutes of his time, and considering the gravitas that he brought as well, I was really, really impressed with that a man of his caliber would be interested in what was then a small but growing movement. And he fundamentally said the same sort of thing. He used the Barassi line as yep. an example. but he changed it to the tie line. And he indicated that the man who invented the concept of the smashed avocado, which is a meme all over the world now, indicated that the tie line could perhaps be a new state line. But something else I really want to get your perception on is I know the IPA is a great supporter of competitive federalism. What's your take on how competitive the competitive federalism is now, and what impact a new state could potentially have on the dynamics in between the different states?
Yeah, well, Matt, I think that's a really important question. And I don't think of federalism as an all-embracing democratic term necessarily, in the same way as I never use the term states' rights. States don't have rights. People have rights. Citizens have rights. Families have interests. And so the point about federalism, the point about competitive federalism is that you want to disperse power. You want power to be matched by countervailing sources. You don't want any level of government to aggregate all the power over someone's life or over someone's business or over the family. And federation was a way of doing that. And the idea that the Commonwealth is responsible for some spheres and the states are responsible for others is important. But it is also that you have two levels of government, and now with local government, three levels of government to some extent, competing against each other, balancing each other out, allowing people to move between states if there's a problem or if there's a better regime under which someone wants to live. But what we have in Australia at the moment is no such thing as competitive federalism. We have, from the IPA's perspective, and we've done a lot of work on this, we have a national curriculum. So basically, parents don't get a choice as to what their children are taught, and it doesn't matter where you live. Tax rates are basically the same. Environmental protections and levels of red tape are basically the same. You will have extremes at various ends of the spectrum, but you don't get diversity. And one of the things about diversity, one of the things about experimentation, one of the things about difference is you can see what works and what doesn't work. The IPA for a long time has had the position that states should be able to levy their own income tax, for example. And states should be able to attract people. They should be able to attract population and families. Here in Victoria, as a result of the Andrews government and its complete lack of proportionality in relation to its handling of the coronavirus pandemic, we're going to see mass depopulation. We're going to see businesses close. We're going to be seeing many more people come to your part of the world because there are more opportunities. If and when we get a Victorian government that's actually interested in business, interested in the private sector, the levers of power to attract people to come back to Melbourne and Victoria are very, very limited. There's a national industrial relations scheme, for example. There's not a lot of diversity. There's not a lot of difference. And Australia is suffering from one size fits all principle, which I think is just wrong.
Look, of course, I agree with that. And I one of the reasons I'm so excited about a new state is, like, fundamentally for me, it is, of course, about empowering us as North Queenslanders. You know, what we want is representation. We want empowerment. We want autonomy, and we want control over our own lives. We want to be able to make those rules. We want to be able to make rules about the things that matter to us. But I genuinely believe that there is a national interest in this. And I think a new state would really, really be a game changer, because right now you've got organisations like COAG, you've got this national cabinet, which David Flint talks about, the excellent David Flint talks about a lot. And fundamentally, the way I see these things is really a comfortable cartel of people who kind of get together. Now, I think the dynamic that most impacts on that is when you get these elected representatives together. Of course, we think that it's the elected representatives who do the governing. Of course, the vast majority of day-to-day governing is done by unelected bureaucrats. Now, if you get these comfortable cartels together, once the decisions are made by the elected representatives, which is right and good in a democracy, then the issue, then the day-to-day governing comes for the bureaucrats. And the issue becomes then, and I can actually speak like when I'm dealing with people from other areas, because I'm a bureaucrat. One of the issues that one of the main
wash your mouth out.
Yeah, I know, mea culpa, man, maximum culpa. But
poacher, you're a poacher turned gamekeeper.
Yeah, I know. You know, Judas himself would probably look at me and go, you know, that guy's a little bit of a traitor right there. But one of the dynamics I know definitely does evolve is that it becomes getting on with your colleagues. So it no longer becomes about the people of the state. It becomes about getting on. It becomes about getting on with your colleagues. And imagine a world where a new North Queensland state is formed. So we've just split away from Brisbane. We're kind of going, you know, we don't really want to be pushed around by Brisbane. And we've got a lot of, there's some big distinctions with us, but like, I still do share more in common with someone from Brisbane than I do from, say, Sydney or Melbourne, as much as there are massive distinctions between what I share in common with them. But I genuinely think that with this new state, with the senators that go with it, and of course, think of the other flow-on effects from this, John. We're going to have our own members of the judiciary. We're going to have all these other people, and we're going to be kind of saying to them, well, when you're making a decision in the High Court, if there's someone from the, God willing, sometime in the future, from the new state elected to the High Court, we really want you to go into bat. We want you to make sure that we cut the ties from Brisbane. We didn't do that to be overtaken by Canberra. And I really see us as a bit of a touchstone moment. And I can see a time where other states, because I'm pretty sure you'd be aware of the historical precedent of New England, the New England state movement, which unfortunately was defeated in the 60s. But there's been a couple of small new state movements. Well, that would be inaccurate. New colony movements before Federation. One of them was Riverina, and there was also Princeland. So there's been a little bit of movement even around your area around that. Now, I'm not asking you to advocate or not advocate or come on the side of anything specifically, but what do you could you see something like this happening in Victoria, considering there is a bit of a divide between that you outlined before, the urban and the country people? Could you see them being inspired by a new state movement in the same way that Brexit has inspired a lot of nationalism in the EU?
Oh, look, and Matt, there's a lot of points to what you said. I'll go back a step first before I come to Victoria. What's exciting about this discussion is not necessarily whether I would advocate for a new state or not, or where the boundary would be, or what would happen to your state of origin competition. Mm-hmm. What's exciting for me is a discussion about how we govern ourselves better. Mm-hmm. It might be one state, it might be 3 or 4 states. A new state may not emerge, but Brisbane might start to take account of people in the regions in a way they haven't had just by having this conversation. I think we tend to assume that the government we have is the government that we will always have. And I don't think we should think like that in the same way as we're having a debate about tax. We must have a discussion about governance. And we have to understand that as radical as a new state might sound to people, and I talk to them about it, and they say that sounds radical and extreme and that will never happen. I say, well, it may not ever happen, but a lot of things have happened that we haven't expected. We would never have thought that, as I mentioned, school curriculum would be decided out of Canberra. We would not have thought that the international treaty organisations would have such a huge influence on our lives. We would not have thought that many things that are now happening decided by Canberra that used to be decided by small communities are now happening. So that's what I think is really exciting about this. There's another point that you made, which is that politicians increasingly have more in common with each other than they do with the people. And people like David Goddhart, the British political philosopher, has talked a lot about this in his work, and he describes and you might have become familiar with this concept of the somewheres and the anywheres, whereby the somewheres are the cosmopolitan elite who can live in particular. Oh, they're the anywheres who can live anywhere, and the somewheres are the people who are bound by their community, by their family, by their work, by their community, by their church or their sports club, and they are in a particular spot. And what he has said is, and he said it in relation to the UK, but it also applies, I think, to the Democrats and the Republicans. It applies to the coalition and the Labor Party here, that the Labor Party, the apparatchiks and the politicians of the Labor Party and the Liberal Party here and the LNP here in Australia have more in common with each other than they do with the people who support them. And so one of the things that a new state could potentially do, or some sort of new organisation could do, is change that dynamic. Instead of everyone always agreeing with each other, instead of everyone saying, well, we need more regulation, we need higher taxes, we need more government involvement, have someone to say, well, no, we're a self-governing entity and we believe that we know how to make our decisions better than you do. In relation to Victoria, I would love to say that we'd be having such a discussion here in Victoria, but we're not. Victoria is an interesting example because as a relatively densely populated state, but of course not that densely compared to any other part of the world, but densely populated compared to Queensland or Western Australia, for example. Melbourne has an outsized role in the affairs of the state. Our media, our Melbourne media, has an outsized role in public discussion in Victoria, as does the ABC. What is interesting is the phenomenon of what's called special economic zones, which are regions where the central government or the state government says there'll be different sorts of governing arrangements. So there might be different sorts of red tape provisions, different sorts of tax provisions. And there's a famous example of after our devastating bushfires here in Victoria a couple of years ago, the Labor government said, well, we'll set up a special economic zone in some of these bushfire affected areas, and we would make planning applications proceed quicker to encourage economic growth. Fantastic idea.
Look,
why don't we do that always? You don't need a bushfire and the tragedy of a bushfire and the creation of a special economic zone to understand that we should approve planning processes more quickly so people can invest and create jobs. So whether it's special economic zones, whether it's new states, whether it's different sorts of regions, this is exactly what Australia needs to be talking about.
Well, precisely. I can actually speak with some, a little bit, authority is perhaps the wrong word, but some experience in regards to that. I lived in China for a year, and the area I lived in China was in fact a special economic zone. And
exactly.
Yeah, you could feel the vibe, not just the northern vibe, listeners, but you could feel the vibe of where I lived in China, and it was the place that was attracting the immigrants. It was attracting the the smart young up and coming people, the great and the good. It was the place where people did want to settle. So it's this competitive idea that kind of brings things about. And you touched on the somewhere anywhere thing. I'm a great believer in that. And obviously, that was the one of the dynamics in the Brexit shock, which still brings a smile to my face anytime I think about it. And if you think of electorates like Cook, which is the most far northern Queensland electorate, it's around 288,000 square kilometres. I'm going to say that again, 288,000 square kilometres. And Thursday Island, which is a place where I've spent time, I spent a very happy 2.5 years up there, is around 2,100 kilometres from Brisbane. Now, I don't know exactly off the top of my head how far London is away from Moscow, but the dynamics between the Torres Strait Island people and other Indigenous people who disproportionately do make up the Cook electorate are very, very, very different indeed from Brisbane. Now, I really need to clarify this. I don't think that anyone in Brisbane is malicious. I seriously don't think that. But how can someone from Brisbane, as well-intentioned as they are, who's never been outside of the southeast corner, seriously understand what it's like for an Indigenous person who's struggling in a lot of those communities up in North Queensland, who is facing there are real issues up there that really need to be looked after, and there's something that kind of need to experience and need to have a touchstone of really be able to get your head around. And of course, the people closest to any problem or any issue are the best people to make the decisions. So, you know, I validate exactly what you say on that. And it's interesting that you bring up these other nationalist kind of movements. I am to some degree kind of inspired by the Brexit and some of the other phenomena that are going along. Look, are you in a position to comment on you know, whether or not, and speaking not just anecdotally, whether or not too large or bloated political unions work? I'm thinking here like the EU, and also perhaps you'd like to comment on where do you think the UN is going?
Oh, look, they don't work. They will work for a certain amount of time, but in the end, they're unsustainable because ultimately people want the dignity of self-government. And the dignity of self-government means not necessarily that you always get to vote for the winner, but that you get a chance to express a position. And one of the things that struck me, and we could talk about Brexit for hours, but one of the things that struck me about Brexit was so many of the political elites were so confounded by the idea that people would vote for democracy, that this idea that we should be self-governed, this idea that government should be as close to the people as possible, and give it the philosophical, technical name, the idea of subsidiarity, was absolutely confounding them because, of course, in the modern world, less and less decisions are made through the popular process. The rule of experts has been a very strong philosophical trend since Plato. And the idea that there are philosopher kings who know better than the people, who know better than the mob, I think is very dangerous. And that's what Brexit was about. We've seen that in relation to Canberra. We now see the self-perpetuating elite of Canberra and the federal public service. You go to Canberra now and you will meet people who are now third generation public servants who don't know anyone who doesn't own an electric car. They don't know anyone who lives outside a 10-kilometre radius of the ACT. And it comes to your point about difference. And it goes to the United Nations. There is always a role for collaboration and cooperation. Absolutely. Is the world better off for having the United Nations? Yes. But that doesn't mean that you have the United Nations and unelected officials telling governments, national governments, how to govern their own countries. And it's about basically telling, to be more precise, it's not about the United Nations telling people how to govern themselves. So to give an easy example, you know, I was shocked when I saw the Federal Coalition Minister for Roads and Transport going to a United Nations conference talking about speed limits in cities and regions. It has got absolutely nothing to do with the UN. If the Germans want to have a 100 or 120k limit on the Autobahn, if Northern Territorians want to have no speed limit, if Victorians want to have a 30-kilometre speed limit in the suburban streets, it's up to them, not the United Nations, not anyone else. And I don't even think there's a role even for federal government determining what should be local speed limits. As an easy example. So, you know, this goes to the question of why we need to have a debate about new states. It goes to all of this. And if we don't have this debate, then we're going to have the big dislocations potentially that we saw with Trump and with Brexit.
Precisely. Look, one of the things that kind of astounds me is when I look at the comfortable cartels of COAG and places like that, I've seen premiers and elected representatives of the state who seem to want to throw away their authority and throw away their power. And look, I just find it amazing that we've got these elected representatives who seem not to be able to want to govern. I really don't understand. Something I've never really understood is why aren't more members of parliament, regardless of their political persuasion, why aren't they behind this? Because it would kind of make them more relevant. right now you get, and you read it in the newspapers here, and I would imagine it would be the same in Victoria, where we have state MPs saying, well, I'd love to be able to do this, but I can't because it's not doable in Brisbane, or these or other organisations, or, we have to think of the national interest, we have to think of this and this and this. So really that's changed the dynamic from them being our representatives in wherever the legislature is, to them being the representatives of the legislature and the elites to where we live. And that's just turning things right around. Now, if I was an elected MP, I'd want to be as relevant as I possibly could. I'd want to know that my voice mattered, and I'd want to know that I had the kind of people behind me. I'd like you to comment on the psychology behind this. And I know it's not your specific area of, you're not a psychologist, but you do understand the kind of dynamics behind this. Do you think that the idea that people think their kind of MPs are kind of useless and excuse makers, do you think that that impacts on this issue, because it's something that really, that conversation that we had really did impact on me when you talked about just how much the credibility of democracy is diminishing here in Australia, especially around the young.
Well, that's exactly right. And they feel powerless. The young feel powerless because voting doesn't seem to change much. And it's funny you should talk about exactly this point. I filmed a series of 3 podcasts with Tony Abbott, Australia's Future, and we talked about this in the context of politicians following the medical advice, the scientific advice in relation to the managing of the coronavirus pandemic. And we talked about why it is not just that politicians refuse to exercise their wisdom and their judgment against experts, but why so many things seem to be contracted out to expert committees, to the bureaucrats, to cross-party activities. And Tony Abbott put forward a couple of suggestions, whose view, and I share some of his views. He said that the political parties these days, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, are picking people who are safe. They're picking people who are apparatchiks, people who have never expressed an opinion for good or for ill. Social media is winnowing out people who might have said something a little untoward when they were younger. So there is now a premium on bland. We now have politicians who enjoy simply the position, but not the power or the authority. And you now have politicians who feel everything is too complicated for them. And that undermines democracy. The point of a democracy and electing politicians is I can toss them out at elections. The permanent civil service, the permanent bureaucracy, you can't toss out. And you see this in every walk of life. There was an article in the Financial Review a couple of days ago by an economist who said, well, in the same way as we have interest rates determined by an independent committee without the input of politicians, shouldn't tax policy be decided the same way? Well, sure, you can do that. But then you say, well, who are these independent experts? They'll still be appointed by the government. And then you raise a bigger question of, well, what does politicians do? What do they do then? What is politics if it is not to argue about the level of tax? We have expert committees determining health policy. Nearly every aspect of our waking life, of our community life, is determined by the government, but not by our elected politicians, but by expert committees. And it is terribly, terribly dangerous. And it goes to your point, Matt, exactly.
Precisely. Look, and I think I can I can think of a historical precedent right off the top of my head, and it's the it's the atom bomb. Oppenheimer and the chaps there, their job was to find out whether or not it could be done. Now, the decision as to whether or not the weapon was going to be used was not done by an expert committee. Ultimately, the decision was made by the president, an elected representative. And that was made clear really, really, really early. It's true that Oppenheimer developed the bomb and with all the people underneath him, but the decision ultimately lay in the hands of the president. And no one argued that. No one thought it should be anything but the decision of an elected representative. And look, if we're going to do it for a weapon of mass destruction, we're going to recognise that reality. We're going to recognise that the reason we give people authority, and really that's what democracy is about, is giving people authority to act. And of course, taking the responsibility. As you pointed out before, it's like, well, okay, you made this decision, that's fine, but you have to take the responsibility as well. One of the things that I think I see where people are coming from, to give the devil his due, if I can use that analogy. I think now politicians, because we think so globally, that people want to be all things to all people. Now, the simple fact is you can't be all encompassing and consistent at the same time. Look, I'm pro having cake and pro eating it, but you can't be like that. And we can't expect our politicians to be pro having cake and pro eating it realistically. They have to make a decision. There needs to be a hierarchy, of decision making. And the best way to do that is, of course, through the debate, through the democratic process. So yeah, look, this has been a really great conversation through there.
Hey, just before you move on to the next point, I want to just elaborate a little bit on that. So I'm coming to you, and this is about the role of experts. So I'm coming to you from Melbourne, from my house. Right now in Melbourne, experts have said Melburnians must be in their house 23 hours a day, unless it's for work or caregiving. There's a curfew that we're suffering under. You're not allowed outside between the hours of 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. You are allowed 1 hour of exercise a day. You are allowed one trip to the shops per day by one person in your household. Now, experts have decided that is the way allegedly to defeat the coronavirus. Politicians appear to have exercised no independent judgment in that regard. If I want a scientist to tell me how to shut down the coronavirus, I might follow that advice. But here in Victoria, we're suffering a mental health crisis. The presentations for self-harm by under 18s to our public hospitals have gone up by something like 30 or 40% in the last month. We have press conferences where we have the scientists saying, this has happened and this has happened and this has happened. We haven't had anyone saying, can you tell us the mental health consequences of 500,000 Victorians out of work? Oh, no. They say that's not part of our brief. It is our elected politicians to make those decisions. And right now here in Victoria, we are seeing the rule by experts. They won't be accountable. They won't be losing their jobs. In fact, Dan Andrews, as the Victorian Premier, has just had a pay rise. He is now the best paid Premier in Australia. He earns something like $460,000 a year. That is obscene. Public servants, none of whom have lost their job, have just experienced pay rises of 2 or 3%. In Victoria, half of the private sector is on government support. That's what the rule of experts gets you. And we need something different.
Absolutely. And you can...
That's my plea from Victoria to a Northern Queenslander.
Well, of course, yeah, but you can see why psychologically that would happen, because the experts are given a brief. It's like, okay, you need to focus on this one issue. Now,
correct.
The purpose of democracy and the purpose of having elected representatives is to put things in a hierarchy. It's go, okay, well, you don't have one problem to solve. In fact, you have a number of wicked problems, and you chose to stand for office. And I congratulate anyone who actually decides, and I congratulate anyone who does it, even if they do it incompetently, for having the courage to do it, with the qualification, John, with the qualification that they take the responsibility that goes with it. You've pointed out a really, really important issue here for North Queensland. Now, in unwrapping the COVID problem, and no one's suggesting that it's not an issue, but in fixing that problem, we've unwrapped the solutions to a number of other problems. We've unwrapped the solutions to economic issue, the capitalism, basically, We've put the government in control of the economy. We've kind of unwrapped capitalism in regards to health. We are, and I can tell you that we are experiencing the same sorts of issues with mental health. It's something that I have a little bit of knowledge on, having co-authored a book with a chap in New York and written a Churchill Fellowship report on it. So it's something that I'm particularly concerned about. And I'm not saying we shouldn't fix the COVID problem. I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be a lot of thought put into this, but there is a hierarchy. That decision needs to be made, and we can't expect, again, to give the experts their due, we can't expect them to say, all right, we want you to solve the COVID problem, taking into account everything else. It's like, well, no, that's a decision by the people, for the people. Look, could you comment on, I really did want to, I know each conversation, each point we kind of raise is something we kind of want to dig a little bit deeper into, but like taxation. Now, it's such a boring, bland topic that a lot of people don't like to discuss it, but I'd like you to give a comment on the idea of what things could look like if the federal government gave up its taxation powers, and if a new North Queensland state had powers of, took the powers of income tax away from the federal government, and what that would mean for the other states. And also, I know you're pretty well informed about this. If you could give our viewers some indication as to whether or not the taxation system we've got today with federal income tax has to happen, whether it needs to be that way, if it's some sort of constitutional thing, or it's just something that developed as a result of the Second World War.
Well, it's exactly as you said, Matt. In 1901, it had never been contemplated that there be a federal income tax. And when we were talking earlier about how government does change and governance does change, the income tax arrangements we are now experiencing are the result of decisions of the High Court, and then decisions taken by federal politicians. And talking about responsibility or lack thereof, we've seen how in the 50s and 60s, state politicians were happy to give up the powers of responsibility for income tax to the federal government, and they became mendicants, and they would not be accountable for the raising of taxes, but they were able to complain about it. A income tax regime for a new state, such as one as might exist in northern Queensland, could potentially be quite different. There could be dramatically lower levels of income tax to attract people to the state. You might work towards a system such as New Zealand has, of dramatically lowering the top rate of income tax, abolishing the tax-free threshold, and then levying a broader GST on many more things to capture a broader tax base, but reduce the taxes on the sweat and toil of people in that state. It would also mean that there will be some things that the state would not do, and that would be done by citizens themselves. And then you would also look at a system which I think is just as important as tax, which is cheaper power. You could encourage manufacturing, you'd encourage agriculture, you'd get away from this idea that is so prevalent in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, that everyone can work from home. The idea that everyone has to have a university degree and be an IT consultant or a public servant is a long way away from the industries of northern Queensland. So I would put tax in one basket, and together with that, I would also put cheaper energy. You might have an entirely different stamp duty regime. And for example, stamp duty on residential properties is effectively a tax on getting a new job, on losing your job, on getting married or divorced, having a kid, parents getting older, yourself getting older. Stamp duty, as it operates at the state level, is a big barrier to moving around. It is a big barrier to people improving themselves. So you could do a lot of interesting and challenging things. And I'm sure we don't need to talk about the impact of Joh Bjelke-Petersen on abolishing death duties had for the rest of the country. And if someone a state took the opportunity to show what a lower tax regime could deliver for the people, it would be growth, it would be opportunity, and it would be a higher standard of living for everyone in that state and potentially for the whole of the country.
Because finally they'd be able to act in their own rational self-interest rather than the rational self-interest of other people. And really,
That's right.
That does link back to the other conversation we had earlier. Is like, I don't know why elected state representatives seem to want to throw this power away, because really, so you climb to the top, okay? You become the first among equals and you become the premier of the state. Well, without powers to levy any sort of income, that just makes that means you've got to be the best beggar. You've got to be the noisiest and best beggar when you turn up to Canberra. You've got to have the biggest hat to point at them. What is the point of having a state? And I can see too how this impacts on, because we've had two articles in the Sunday Mail recently by a chap who should know a little bit better, actually, if I can make the observation, indicating that he would like to get rid of the states, have a very strong central government, and then delineate powers down to the municipalities. Now, I sincerely did not know where to start on that. Of course, because it would mean clearly he didn't understand that the federation exists because the states say it so, not the other way around. And that would not just mean a slight referendum and change to one or two sections of the Constitution, but in fact tearing it up completely and starting again. And when I hear chaps like Professor David Flint talk about this, I sort of asked him, I said, well, why are they doing this, David? Like, what is, he goes, because that's what they want to happen. They want to disempower people like you from North Queensland. They don't like people like you being able to control your own future. They want to take your wealth and use it for pedestrian bridges down to Brisbane. They want to do these things. Don't think that it's kind of incidental. Again, this conversation I had with an intellectual kind of luminary indicating to me that this wasn't something that was happening incidentally and accidentally, was somewhat of a Damascene moment for me, if I can make the observation.
No, and I think that's the case, and it goes to what we were talking about earlier, which is people's life experience. People simply don't have an understanding of what it is to live pay packet to pay packet. If you are a Canberra public servant, they've got no understanding of moving from contract to contract. There's very little knowledge of what happens outside of the Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne bubble. And that's what this goes to. And it relates to all of the things that we've been talking about. I think some of it is deliberate, but far less of it being deliberate is people not having an understanding and not wanting to know. So down here in Melbourne, for many years, I was on the local ABC channel that goes all through Victoria and into Tasmania. I would walk into the station for my fortnightly slot and then talk to people after federal elections, after state elections. There's one federal election I remember talking to about a dozen people in the ABC studios and the cafeteria. Not a single one of those people knew someone who didn't vote Labor or Green. You know, it goes to life experience. And that's what we're talking about.
Unfortunately, we're coming towards having to wrap things up. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's something I'd like to continue longer. And looking at some of the comments we're getting on our Facebook site, you're getting a bit of love, John. So that's kind of cool as well.
Even if I'm Victorian.
Yeah. Despite...
You know, I mean, this is the thing, you know, when the Prime Minister said we're all Victorians now. No, we're not. And we shouldn't be. You know, Queenslanders saved Australia at the last federal election. The tragedy is that Victorians keep on electing socialist left governments. And the reality is, and I'm a born and bred Victorian and Melburnian, as I said, Victorians have made some terrible decisions, which we are now paying the costs of. And the problem is that the decisions that Victorians have made are on the verge of destroying the Australian economy. They're going to depopulate not just Victoria, but they're going to wreck the opportunities for Australians and young Australians throughout the country. Victorians not coming to Queensland to holiday, not being able to go to the New South Wales for work is going to have a huge impact. And again, it's one thing for us to suffer from our own decisions. It is another thing for the rest of Australia to suffer from a socialist premier who has no understanding of the productive economy, who hired security guards because they fulfilled some diversity and identity politics criterion. And the rest of Australia is suffering, and the rest of Australia is going to have to bail Victoria out. And that's not as it should be.
Yeah, and look, obviously a new state that had its own, had control of its own destiny would allow people to, and indeed encourage people to vote with their feet. So if you kind of, if you like that and you wanted to stay in Victoria, well, hey, go your hardest. But if you wanted to live free and be and live in under a different tax regime and a different, regimes in regards to other issues, then you'd be able to vote with your feet. But look, John, we're really coming. I'm really, really tempted to ask you a couple more questions, but unfortunately, we're really coming towards the end of time. So I'm going to have to wrap things up. Well, actually, I'm going to ask one more. I just can't help it.
Go on. Go ahead.
Really, really quickly. I mean, we've discussed tax. What are the specific issues? What are the, on the hierarchy of concerns? What are the specific issues do you think that a new North Queensland state could really act on? What sort of issues that it could make a real difference on? What for us? Two
key ones, and they're not state issues. They're issues about people and families, supporting the working class and the middle class. That's around small business, creating and supporting and not discouraging small business, cutting red tape and getting people to invest, welcoming people to take an investment in their lives and have the dignity of work. And the other thing is home ownership. The idea that owning your own home, supporting your family is part of security for yourself, for your long-term future for the family, and it also creates more stable, more secure societies. Having a stake in the community is really important. The idea that we don't have a stake, that we have nothing in common with our neighbour, that we are all different is what I think is undermining our sense of community, undermining our sense of well-being. The idea that we share a common history, regardless of our skin colour, of our background. The idea that democracy is important, freedom of speech is important, freedom of religion is important. All of these things go to create a society in which we could flourish. So I would be up to Northern Queensland as quick as a flash once I'm allowed to leave Victoria, if ever I'm able to. But a new state could create a sense of community. It could create a sense of purpose around small business, around enterprise, and also around home ownership and community, which are the heart of the Australian way of life.
And look, and that's so important. Look, one of the early interviews I did was with a magnificent lady called Yodi Batsky, who is a very proud Indigenous woman who's standing to be an independent member of the seat of Cook. And she spoke very, very strongly in regards to identity and the ideas that democracy is for everybody. This is not a thing just for people with skin color. The idea of personal empowerment, of democracy, of the sovereign individual, of people being able to control their identity, take responsibility for their actions, both good and bad, and reap the rewards of their efforts. I mean, that's in it. They're human rights.
To have a go. It is the Australian way to have a go. And the Australian way is for us to be equal. No one's better than me, and I'm better than no one else either. That's the Australian way, and that's the Australian way that attracted my parents to Australia after the war. I'm first generation. and I was lucky they picked to come to the greatest country in the world. But is Australia still that? I think it is. Will we be that into the future? I'm not sure unless we make some changes.
Well, as tempting as it is to ask you another question, because two or three just popped into my mind, we really are going to have to wrap it up there. Look, John, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule down there to speak to us today. Really hope that you promote our little organisation as much as you can through your excellent IPA networks. If I can also give a plug to all our listeners, regardless of political persuasion, and I know there is we're getting a growing number of people across the political spectrum watching Northern Vibe, which is absolutely fantastic. You can tell from some of the comments we're getting that there is a little bit of a disagreement with the way that things should go, but that's really healthy. Love that debate. We absolutely welcome it. I do encourage everybody to have a look at the IPA website. I'm one of those 6,000 members of the Institute of Public Affairs. Anyone who is interested in thought, public affairs and self-education really should get on their website, should consider joining. And let me tell you, some of the programs they run are absolutely fantastic. The Western Civilization program just warmed my heart, and it's stuff that I use to educate my kids. And of course, another big plug about ourselves, please like and share. We are becoming a little bit more professional, a little bit better each time we do one of these podcast videos. If you thought John Roskam was a cool, exciting guest, you'd be right. We're going to get people of his caliber in the future. I don't want to give too much away just yet, but I'm in conversation with some really exciting people, and we'll get them on. We'll get them to discuss this issue. So like us, share us, make sure that your friends know, and do join the conversation. So look, John, on that, anything you want to say before we wrap things up?
No, it's great to be with you. It's great you're doing this. There's got to be a better way. It is about saving, protecting, extending the Australian way of life, and good luck to you.
Yeah, look, it is kind of cool. Like, I've got to say, and please join Boot Brisbane and the debate in regards to that too. I really encourage people to get on that. And if a yobbo like me can just start up a podcast and start speaking to people of the caliber of John, start getting involved in these debates, and very quickly within 4 or 5 podcasts reach over 1,000 people per view. Like, pretty much anyone can do this. I'd encourage anyone, get involved in the debate, come and join us, have a chat, be part of this magnificent new future. Like, there are very few times in human history where we actually get to shape our political future, where we can really make a difference to the structure of the way things work. This is one of those moments. So please join us. Thank you very much, John, again. Really hope we get to catch up socially in the near future. And I'll get you to, I'll end the recording and all that, but I'll call you slightly after the meeting if that's okay.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much.